Arthur thought he was saving his dying company when he publicly humiliated his ex-wife and kicked her out of the boardroom. He accused her of leaking his deepest secrets. But he was making a catastrophic mistake. The real traitor destroying his life was sitting right next to him, smiling, and the woman he just banished, she was secretly the anonymous investor desperately trying to save his entire empire. What happens when you accidentally destroy your only savior? Make sure you watch until the very end to find out exactly how this incredible story unfolds. Before we continue, please take a quick second to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Also, drop a comment below and let me know where you are watching from today. I absolutely love seeing where in the world my viewers are tuning in from. Now, let's dive into the story. The sound of Arthur Pendleton's voice cracking under the weight of sheer desperation echoed off the cold glass walls of the executive suite. He wasn't just raising his voice. He was fighting for his life's work. At 55 years old, Arthur was the founder of Pendleton Freight, a legacy logistics empire that had weathered recessions, supply chain collapses, and labor strikes. But it was not weathering this. The company was hemorrhaging cash at an unprecedented, terrifying rate. And to make matters infinitely worse, their most tightly guarded financial vulnerabilities had just been leaked. A predatory holding company was circling, armed with internal data that only a handful of people in the room possessed. The sharks were in the water, preparing for a hostile takeover, and Arthur was absolutely convinced that someone sitting at this very mahogany table was deliberately pouring the blood. His bloodshot eyes darted past his trusted executives and locked onto the one person he believed had the motive to destroy him. Sarah, his ex-wife, sat quietly at the far end of the table, a remnant from a past life, who retained a minority board seat as part of an exhausting divorce settlement years ago. For Arthur, the narrative practically wrote itself. Who else would hand over his legacy to corporate raiders? Who else would want to see him publicly lose everything he had built? Paranoia, fueled by weeks of sleepless nights and mounting debt, completely hijacked his reason. Pointing a trembling finger directly at her, Arthur did the unthinkable. He didn't just accuse her of corporate espionage. He put her on trial in front of the people who used to be her friends. He didn't wait for her to defend herself. Driven by a frantic need to stop the bleeding, Arthur slammed his hands on the table and invoked a rarely used emergency clause in the company's corporate bylaws. In one swift, ruthless motion, he stripped Sarah of her voting rights, citing an immediate conflict of interest and breach of fiduciary duty. He demanded her total ejection from the board and her immediate removal from the premises. The executives around the table held their breath, bracing for the explosion. They expected a scream, a threat, a vicious legal counterattack. After all, Arthur had just publicly humiliated her, severing her last remaining connection to the company they had once fostered together. But the explosion never came. Sarah did not raise her voice. She did not scramble to defend her character or beg for a chance to explain. Instead, a heavy, suffocating silence fell over the room as she calmly unclasped her leather briefcase and began placing her meticulously organized folders inside. The sheer tranquility of her movements unnerved everyone watching, most of all Arthur. She closed the brass latches with a soft, final click. When she finally looked up, there was no hatred in her eyes. There was only a profound, chilling mixture of pity and grave warning. She stood up, pushing her chair in smoothly, and looked directly into Arthur's exhausted face. Her voice was steady, cutting through the thick tension of the room with absolute clarity. "You are locking the doors, Arthur," she said softly, while the fire is already inside. Without another word, she turned and walked out of the boardroom, her footsteps fading down the long, empty hallway. As the heavy glass door swung shut behind her, Arthur exhaled a long, shaky breath, letting his shoulders drop. He looked around at the remaining faces at the table, firmly believing that he had just excised a traitor. He was certain he had just saved his company. He couldn't have been more wrong. The artificial high of the boardroom confrontation evaporated the moment Arthur stepped out into the freezing air of the main shipping yard. The roar of diesel engines and the heavy clanking of steel shipping containers grounded him in an agonizing reality. This wasn't just about balance sheets, stock valuations, or bruised corporate pride. It was about the blood and sweat moving around him. He watched a gray-haired forklift operator, a man who had been with the company since its inception, wave at him through a dirty windshield. 400 men and women worked in these yards. Most of them were well past their 50th birthdays, having dedicated the prime of their lives to Pendleton Freight. If the gates were padlocked, these people wouldn't just lose their jobs. They would lose their pensions, their stability, and their ability to provide for their families. The immense weight of their livelihoods pressed down on Arthur's chest like a physical anchor. Footsteps crunched on the frost-covered gravel behind him. It was Julian, the company's chief financial officer, and Arthur's closest friend for over 2 decades. Julian handed him a steaming cup of black coffee, his expression carved with the same mutual exhaustion that Arthur felt. "You made the only call you could," Julian said quietly, his voice designed to steady Arthur's lingering doubts. "Sarah was a vulnerability we simply couldn't afford anymore. You had to protect the perimeter. Now we can finally focus on survival." Hearing those words from a man he trusted implicitly acted as a temporary balm on Arthur's fraying nerves. Julian had stood shoulder to shoulder with him through every economic downturn, and in Arthur's exhausted mind, his CFO was the only person keeping the ship afloat. But survival was a rapidly shrinking window. The cold truth of their impending ruin hung between them in the frigid morning air. The timeline was absolute. They had exactly 72 hours. If they could not secure a $5 million bridge loan by the end of the business day on Friday, the banks would execute a total foreclosure of the shipping yards. Every truck, every crane, and every inch of asphalt would be seized and liquidated to satisfy the aggressive creditors. The logistics empire Arthur had spent 30 agonizing years building was mere days away from being carved up and sold for scrap. Julian took a slow sip of his coffee, his gaze drifting out over the towering rows of stacked cargo. "We have to be realistic, Arthur," he murmured, his tone shifting smoothly from supportive to cautiously pragmatic. "The market knows we are bleeding. The banks are actively locking us out. But there is still one play left on the table." Julian pulled a crisp, heavily folded document from his wool coat pocket. It was a buyout offer from a faceless private equity firm, a fraction of what the company was actually worth. "It is a brutal haircut," Julian admitted softly, "but it prevents a total bankruptcy. It salvages what is left of your reputation. You sign this. You walk away with something, and maybe they keep a fraction of the workforce on the payroll. If we fight this and miss that loan deadline, the bank takes it all, and these workers get absolutely nothing." It sounded so painfully reasonable. It sounded exactly like the rational advice of a loyal friend trying to save a drowning man. Arthur stared blindly at the document, entirely unaware that the man offering him a life preserver was the very same one who had drilled the holes in the bottom of his boat. The next 48 hours dissolved into a humiliating, exhausting blur of dial tones, forced smiles, and quiet rejections. Arthur locked himself in his office, armed with 3 decades of accumulated goodwill, a vast network of powerful industry contacts, and a desperate hope that loyalty still held currency in the modern business world. He called former partners, regional bank presidents he had golfed with for years, and private lenders who had practically begged to finance his expansions a decade prior. He swallowed every ounce of his hard-earned pride, laying his company's survival bare on the line. He asked for favors. He offered personal guarantees. He even offered to put up his own family estate as collateral for the $5 million bridge loan. But the answers were uniformly devastating. Men who had once clinked whiskey glasses with him at charity galas suddenly became completely unavailable. Urgent calls were smoothly routed to voicemails. Assistants offered polite, hollow apologies. The physical toll of the grind began to show. Arthur's shirts were permanently wrinkled. His coffee went cold on his desk, and his eyes burned from staring at the merciless ticking clock on his computer monitor. The isolation was profound. In the span of 2 days, the logistics titan had been reduced to a financial pariah. The industry smelled blood in the water, and nobody wanted to stand next to a dying giant when the final blow was struck. He paced the floor of his office, the suffocating pressure of 400 impending job losses tightening around his throat. Every rejection felt like a physical strike, chipping away at the foundation of his sanity. But as the rejections piled up, the agonizing despair slowly gave way to a creeping, icy sense of confusion. A disturbing pattern began to emerge in the conversations he did manage to secure. Three different commercial lenders, operating completely independently of one another, cited the exact same obscure reason for denying the loan. They didn't just mention general market instability or his high debt-to-income ratio. Instead, they casually referenced a highly specific, heavily buried discrepancy regarding offshore leasing liabilities from the third quarter. It was an anomaly so deeply hidden in the company's internal ledgers that Arthur himself had barely understood it when Julian had presented the private risk assessment weeks ago. These were strictly proprietary figures. They were not part of the public prospectus, nor had they been included in any of the loan applications Arthur had just submitted. Arthur sat frozen at his heavy oak desk, the receiver slipping from his ear as a junior loan officer abruptly ended yet another call. Sarah had been gone for 2 days. Her administrative access had been severed, and her accounts were permanently locked. Yet, the most sensitive, damaging financial intelligence was still actively bleeding out into the marketplace, landing directly on the desks of his creditors. The realization hit him with the blunt force of a freight train. The leak had not been stopped. Sarah was never the mole. The fire she had warned him about was still raging uncontrollably, burning to the last remaining pillars of his empire. The saboteur was still inside the building. But Arthur was running on empty, his mind too starved to sleep and utterly overwhelmed by the ticking clock to look past the thick smoke and see the arsonist standing right next to him. The digital clock on Arthur's desk flashed mercilessly, signaling that less than 24 hours remained before the final foreclosure. He sat in the dim light of his office, his spirit entirely broken, waiting for the final, fatal call from the bank. But the phone did not ring. Instead, a timid knock broke the heavy silence. A junior accountant, clutching a stack of warm printouts, stepped into the room looking bewildered. He bypassed the usual chain of command, explaining to Arthur that something utterly inexplicable was happening within their account's payable matrix. The aggressive, relentless collection calls from their secondary creditors had abruptly ceased. The suffocating pressure from vendors demanding immediate payment had vanished in the span of a single morning. Arthur scanned the documents, his exhausted mind struggling to process the data. A massive influx of capital was moving through the market, systematically sweeping up Pendleton Freight's peripheral debt. The high-interest vendor lines and toxic short-term loans that were acting as a chokehold on the company were being bought out in rapid succession. The purchaser was an anonymous entity operating behind the impenetrable walls of a blind trust registered simply as Aegis Capital. Even more confusing, this phantom buyer wasn't calling the debts in or demanding immediate restructuring. They were simply holding the paper. For the first time in months, the immediate execution had been stayed. Arthur stared at the spreadsheets, a faint flicker of hope igniting in his chest. Was this a silent investor? A hidden ally? Before Arthur could even articulate the thought, the office door flew open. Julian stormed into the room, his normally flawless, composed demeanor completely shattered. His face was flushed, and a sheen of nervous sweat coated his forehead. He had seen the routing numbers. But where Arthur saw a momentary reprieve, Julian projected absolute terror. He snatched the printouts from the desk, aggressively dismissing the junior accountant from the room. Pacing like a caged animal, Julian vehemently framed Aegis Capital not as a savior, but as an apex predator. He insisted this was a classic, ruthless maneuver by a vulture fund, a shadow corporation consolidating all the company's vulnerable debt into one massive weapon, preparing to deliver a single, inescapable kill shot. Julian slapped the heavily creased private equity buyout papers directly in front of Arthur, pressing a heavy gold pen into his trembling hand. His voice was frantic, his words a barrage of worst-case scenarios. He warned Arthur that if Aegis Capital gained majority control of the debt, they would bypass the standard bankruptcy courts, strip the company down to the copper wiring, and leave every single worker with nothing. The lowball buyout, Julian argued desperately, was their only shield. It was a guaranteed, immediate exit that preempted the Phantom Raiders' strike. Arthur stared down at the signature line, the pen feeling like a lead weight between his fingers. The room felt devoid of oxygen. He was trapped in an excruciating psychological vice. On one side stood his oldest friend, offering humiliating but certain surrender that would permanently end his legacy. On the other side was an unseen, unknowable force that had just bought him the most precious commodity in business: time. Torn between fleeing a known fire and stepping into the dark, Arthur hovered the pen over the paper, agonizing over whether to fight a ghost or finally concede defeat. The glow of the streetlights barely pierced the heavy darkness of the Pendleton Freight executive floor. It was past midnight on the eve of the final deadline, and the silence of the building was deafening. Sleep had been an impossible luxury for Arthur. Knowing that tomorrow he would officially hand over the keys to his life's work, he had driven back to the headquarters to do the only thing left: pack up his personal history. The ghosts of 30 years of relentless ambition seemed to echo in the empty hallways as he placed framed photographs and industry awards into a cardboard box. Seeking a final piece of sentimental closure, he realized he was missing the original handwritten founding ledger, a worn, leather-bound book he had lent to Julian months ago for a retrospective tax audit. He walked down the corridor and used his master key to unlock Julian's immaculate corner office. Moonlight spilled across the polished desk as Arthur opened the heavy mahogany drawers, his hands searching in the dark for the familiar texture of the old ledger. Instead, his fingers brushed against the cold glass of a sleek, personal tablet tucked beneath a stack of blank letterheads. Arthur bumped the device, and the screen instantly flared to life. In his frantic, sweating rush to push the buyout papers that afternoon, Julian, a man usually obsessed with airtight cybersecurity, had made a catastrophic error. He had forgotten to lock the screen. Arthur intended to turn the device off, but a minimized email draft caught his eye. The recipient address belonged to the exact private equity firm Julian had been so desperate to sell to. A cold dread settled in Arthur's stomach. He tapped the screen, opening a hidden, nested directory. What he found inside was not a series of unfortunate corporate losses, but a masterclass in financial assassination. Row after row of meticulously doctored invoices sat beside ledgers, showing millions of dollars quietly siphoned into offshore shell companies over the past 18 months. Arthur's logistical mind, trained to track thousands of moving variables, decoded the raw data with terrifying speed. He found the phantom leaks. There, sitting in plain text, were the highly classified third-quarter liabilities that the banks had used to deny his loan applications. Julian had been feeding them the poison directly. Pendleton Freight wasn't failing due to market pressures. It was being systematically suffocated. Julian had engineered the entire collapse, intentionally tanking the company's valuation, so his secret partners at the equity firm could swoop in and purchase the sprawling logistics empire for absolute pennies. The breath left Arthur's lungs as the devastating magnitude of the betrayal washed over him. The man who had stood shoulder to shoulder with him, the trusted confidant who had offered him a life preserver, was the very same man who had drilled the holes in the hull. And then, a sharper, more agonizing realization pierced through the shock. Sarah, his ex-wife, had never leaked a single document. She had been entirely innocent. He had publicly executed the wrong person, stripping her of her dignity, while the true architect of his ruin smiled and handed him a pen. The gray light of morning offered no warmth as Arthur Pendleton stood before the towering glass and steel cathedral of the downtown banking district. It was the day of the final foreclosure, and the biting wind off the street felt like a fitting end to a 30-year legacy. He walked through the revolving doors not as a titan of industry, but as a dead man walking. The knowledge he carried from the previous night was a heavy, suffocating burden. He knew exactly how the floor had collapsed beneath him. He knew every detail of Julian's meticulous, treasonous architecture. But in the ruthless world of commercial finance, truth without capital was entirely useless. Knowing the identity of his executioner did not stop the blade from falling. He was utterly devoid of the $5 million required to halt the proceedings. As he stepped into the elevator, watching the floor numbers climb, his impending financial ruin was entirely overshadowed by a profound, agonizing wave of personal regret. The image of Sarah's face, calm, pitying, and entirely innocent, burned in his mind. He had publicly slaughtered the character of the only person who had tried to warn him, all while blindly protecting the architect of his demise. The doors parted, revealing the sterile, intimidating chill of the bank's executive suite. Arthur was escorted into a cavernous conference room dominated by a sprawling mahogany table. On one side sat a row of grim-faced banking executives, their briefcases open, the thick stacks of foreclosure documents already neatly aligned. And there, Sitting at the end of the table was Julian. The CFO wore a perfectly tailored charcoal suit and a masterfully crafted expression of somber sympathy. Julian stood as Arthur entered, offering a solemn nod and a quiet, hollow reassurance that they had done everything they possibly could. The sheer audacity of the performance turned Arthur's stomach to ash. It took every ounce of his remaining willpower not to leap across the table and wrap his hands around his oldest friend's throat. Instead, Arthur sank into his leather chair in complete silence. He was a king with no army, forced to sit beside the traitor who had poisoned his cup, waiting for the invading forces to arrive. The heavy antique clock on the wall ticked mercilessly toward the 9 o'clock deadline. The bank's lead liquidator checked his silver wristwatch, clearing his throat to announce that the proceedings were ready to commence. They were merely waiting on one final participant. The legal execution of Pendleton Freight could not be finalized until the representative of Aegis Capital, the anonymous shadow entity that had aggressively bought up the majority of the toxic debt, arrived to formally claim the assets. Julian leaned in close, whispering a final, toxic platitude about how at least the bleeding would finally stop today. Arthur ignored him, staring blankly at the polished wood of the table. He braced himself for the heavy boardroom doors to open, fully expecting a ruthless, faceless corporate raider to walk in and finally rip the keys to his empire from his hands. The heavy oak doors of the boardroom swung open with a resounding thud, shattering the suffocating silence. Every head at the massive mahogany table turned, expecting to see a ruthless corporate liquidator ready to carve up the remains of Pendleton Freight. Instead, a team of 3 people stepped over the threshold. Flanking the entrance were 2 stern, impeccably dressed forensic auditors, carrying heavy, metal-class briefcases. But it was the person leading them that caused the oxygen to instantly vanish from the room. It was Sarah. The collective shock paralyzed the banking executives. Julian blinked rapidly, his carefully constructed mask of sorrow faltering into genuine, stammering confusion. He instinctively sat up straighter, his mind frantically racing to calculate why Arthur's disgraced ex-wife would dare show her face at a closed foreclosure hearing. Arthur, however, was entirely shell-shocked, feeling as though the floor had just dropped out from beneath his chair. Sarah did not look at Arthur. There was no glare of vindication, no lingering stare of anger, and no trace of the humiliation she had endured days earlier. She operated with a cold, absolute authority that instantly commanded the space. Bypassing the empty chairs reserved for spectators, she walked directly to the head of the table, standing opposite the lead bank liquidator. Julian immediately opened his mouth, attempting to weaponize his condescension, demanding to know how building security had allowed an unauthorized party to interrupt a confidential financial proceeding. Sarah ignored him completely. Without uttering a single syllable in his direction, she extended her hand. One of the auditors stepped forward and placed a massive, heavily tabbed leather binder directly into her palm. With a smooth, deliberate push, she slid the monumental dossier across the polished wood. It stopped perfectly in front of the lead banking executive. The banker adjusted his glasses, looking from the heavy binder to Sarah with deep bewilderment. He reached out, fully expecting to read a standard liquidation agreement or an aggressive asset seizure demand drafted by the phantom entity known as Aegis Capital. He unclasped the binder and flipped to the executive summary. The color drained from his face almost instantly. Sarah finally broke the silence, her voice echoing with commanding, razor-sharp precision. She introduced herself not as a former board member or an aggrieved ex-wife, but as the sole proprietor and managing director of the blind trust they knew as Aegis Capital. The room plunged into a stunned, absolute stillness. She looked directly at the banking executives and informed them that the document they were holding was not a surrender of assets. It was a certified, legally binding forensic audit. With devastating clarity, she outlined exactly what was contained within those hundreds of pages. It was a flawless, irrefutable unmasking of systemic corporate sabotage. She detailed the doctored invoices, the offshore wire transfers, and intentionally falsified third-quarter liabilities that the banks had used to deny the bridge loans. She pointed directly at Julian, exposing his elaborate scheme to artificially tank the company's valuation for a predatory buyout by his secret partners. Pendleton Freight was not failing. Stripped of the manufactured debt and the embezzled funds, the logistics empire was, in fact, highly profitable. Arthur sat completely paralyzed in his chair, watching in breathless awe as the woman he had so ruthlessly cast out single-handedly dismantled the trap that was meant to destroy him. The lead banking executive rapidly turned the pages of the dossier, his eyes tracking the undeniable proof of wire fraud and corporate espionage. Julian's carefully maintained facade crumbled into a pathetic display of panic. He stammered, frantically attempting to dismiss the audit as a desperate fabrication, a forged retaliation from a bitter ex-wife. But Sarah didn't even raise her voice to counter his frantic lies. She simply recited account numbers, transaction dates, and offshore routing codes with lethal photographic precision. She revealed to the silent room that she had suspected the CFO's systemic theft for nearly 8 months. Her quiet presence at those tense board meetings, the very presence that had driven Arthur to paranoia, was never about leaking proprietary intelligence. She had been using her minority access to quietly trace the digital breadcrumbs Julian was leaving behind, slowly assembling the weapon needed to cut the cancer out of Arthur's company. But her meticulous, covert investigation had been violently interrupted. Sarah turned her gaze toward Arthur for the first time, her expression completely devoid of malice, yet carrying a weight that made him want to sink into the floor. When he had publicly accused her, when he had invoked emergency bylaws to strip her of her access and throw her out of the building, he hadn't just humiliated her. He had blinded his only watchman, cut off from the internal servers. She was suddenly forced to fight a war from the outside, with Julian's shadow partners rapidly closing in for the final kill. Sarah had taken a staggering, incomprehensible risk. She explained to the paralyzed room that she had immediately liquidated her entire personal portfolio, cashed out her private estate, and leveraged every single asset she owned to form Aegis Capital overnight. She hadn't bought up Pendleton Freight's toxic debt to stage a hostile takeover. She had bought it to build an impenetrable financial firewall between Arthur and the men trying to destroy him. The gravity of her sacrifice hung heavily in the freezing air of the executive suite. The banking officials, recognizing the absolute liability sitting at their table, swiftly closed their briefcases. The lead liquidator looked at Julian with utter disgust and signaled the armed building security, standing just outside the glass doors. Julian's frantic protest died in his throat as 2 imposing guards flanked him, gripping his arms and dragging him out of the boardroom in complete, irredeemable disgrace. The elaborate trap he had spent a year building had been shattered into dust in less than 10 minutes. As the heavy doors clicked shut behind the disgraced CFO, the bankers quietly excused themselves, citing an immediate need to contact federal authorities regarding the wire fraud. Suddenly, the cavernous boardroom was empty, save for Arthur and the woman he had treated like an enemy. He remained frozen in his leather chair, staring at the architect of his salvation. The realization crashed over him with the force of a collapsing building. She had absorbed his paranoia, accepted his public abuse, and silently risked her own financial ruin, all to save the legacy of a man who had thrown her to the wolves. The heavy oak doors clicked shut, leaving a profound, ringing silence in their wake. The bankers were gone. The liquidators had retreated, and the immediate threat of total ruin had vanished. Yet, sitting alone in the cavernous boardroom with the woman he had so viciously wronged, Arthur felt heavier than ever before. He was completely crushed by the immense weight of his own guilt. He stared at his trembling hands, unable to meet her gaze, his mind struggling to reconcile the sheer magnitude of her sacrifice with the cruelty of his recent actions. When he finally forced himself to look up, his voice was barely a ragged whisper, breaking under the strain of absolute remorse. He asked a single, agonizing question that was tearing him apart. Why? Why risk her entire personal fortune, her future, and her security to save a man who had publicly dragged her name to the mud and cast her aside? Sarah did not answer immediately. She slowly pulled out the chair across from him and sat down, her posture softening for the first time since she had entered the room. When she finally spoke, her words did not reference corporate valuations, blind trusts, or fiduciary duties. Instead, she took him back a quarter of a century. She took him back to a time long before logistics empires, boardrooms, and bitter divorce settlements. She softly spoke the name of her younger sister, a name that brought an instant, sharp sting of memory to Arthur's eyes. She painted the agonizing picture of a devastating car accident 25 years ago that had left her sister uninsured, completely broken, and facing a lifelong diagnosis of total paralysis. Sarah recalled the suffocating despair her family had endured, drowning in medical bills they could never hope to pay, watching the light fade from a young girl's life. And then, she reminded Arthur of what he had done. He was just a young man then, struggling to build the very foundation of the company he had nearly lost today. But he possessed one precious asset, a sprawling tract of prime valley land left to him by his grandfather, a prized inheritance meant to be his ultimate safety net. Sarah's voice trembled slightly as she recounted the sheer disbelief her family felt when those catastrophic hospital debts were suddenly erased, and the costly experimental surgeries her sister desperately needed were anonymously funded in full. It had taken Sarah years to unravel the quiet paper trail and discover that Arthur had secretly liquidated his grandfather's land to save a girl he barely knew. He had never boasted about it. He had never demanded gratitude or recognition. Even years later, as their marriage fractured and dissolved into the painful negotiations of a bitter divorce, Arthur had never once weaponized that monumental sacrifice. He had never used his profound generosity as leverage. It had been an act of pure, unadulterated kindness. Sarah reached across the polished mahogany table and rested her hand gently near his. She looked directly into his tear-filled eyes, her voice steady and echoing with absolute conviction. She told him that when the world turns dark, you do not abandon a man who once willingly carried your family's heaviest burden. The boardroom remained utterly silent, save for quiet, staggering realization that true kindness, no matter how deeply buried by time or obscured by anger, never truly expires. 6 months later, the freezing winds of that desperate winter had given way to the warm, golden light of early summer. The Pendleton freight shipping yards were alive with a deafening, beautiful symphony of industry. Diesel engines roared, massive steel cranes hoisted cargo high into the clear sky, and heavily loaded trucks rolled seamlessly through the front gates. The 400 men and women who had stood on the terrifying precipice of unemployment were entirely safe. Their pensions remained intact. Their families were secure, and their daily routines continued without the looming shadow of corporate liquidation. Walking the sunlit asphalt among his crew, Arthur Pendleton was a fundamentally transformed man. The frantic, paranoid executive who had once paced the halls of his corporate suite was gone. In his place stood a leader grounded by immense humility and a profound sense of clarity. He no longer viewed his company merely as a spreadsheet of assets and liabilities, but as a living testament to second chances. That second chance had not miraculously rebuilt a broken marriage into a cinematic romance. Arthur and Sarah did not fall back into the romantic entanglement of their past, because real life rarely ties itself up in such simple, perfect bows. Instead, what rose from the ashes of their conflict was something arguably much stronger, an unbreakable, profound bond of absolute mutual respect. Sarah had officially taken her rightful seat at the head of the boardroom table, no longer a sideline minority shareholder, but an equal partner and the visionary managing director of Aegis Capital. They led the logistics empire together. Two seasoned veterans who had weathered the absolute worst of human betrayal and emerged completely unified. The toxicity that Julian had seeded was meticulously purged, and the foundation they rebuilt upon was impenetrable. Their story serves as a powerful testament to a truth we often forget in a ruthless, rapidly moving world. We are frequently taught that success is solely a landscape of cutthroat ambition, cold calculations, and aggressive defense. But true security is never found in offshore accounts or blind paranoia. It is found in the quiet, unheralded sacrifices we make for others when absolutely no one is watching. The seeds of genuine kindness that we plant in the darkest, most desperate moments of our lives do not just fade away. They remain buried in the soil of our shared history, quietly taking root, waiting to bloom into an unshakable shield exactly when we need it most. Arthur sacrificed his own future to save a young girl's life out of pure grace, and decades later, that single act reached across time to save his own. It is a beautiful reminder that no act of true generosity is ever wasted. We would love to hear your thoughts on Arthur and Sarah's incredible journey. If you found yourself in Arthur's position, facing complete ruin, who is the one person from your past that you know would stand by your side? Share your answers in the comments below. If this story moved you, please take a moment to like this video, share it with someone who appreciates a powerful tale of redemption, and subscribe to our channel for more grounded, emotional stories. Thank you for listening.